Is your life made up of misery? Then dumb, the moss is off your back. Are your clothes all worn and tattered? Are you living in a shack? Would you see your troubles scattered? Then dumb, the moss is off your back.
I want to welcome you to the Workers' Power Forum on Women in the Recession. This is sponsored by the International Socialists. It's our view that the liberation of women from the sexism that pervades all aspects of life within the family, personal relations, and within the labor force can't be accomplished under capitalism through reform or legislation. The interests of those who prosper under capitalism are not served by the liberation of women, as they're not served by the liberation of blacks and other oppressed minorities. While not intrinsically necessary to capitalism, sexism and racism are historically tools of capitalism. Both serve to divide the working class against one another, pitting men against women, black against white, and blinding them to their real enemies, the bosses and the capitalists. Both enable capital to have a reserve army of labor, used when necessary and left to stand by as a threat to those who are already employed, a threat which undermines and restrains the demands of workers to a rightful return on their labor. Capitalism will not renounce these tools, sexism and racism. Reform through legislation will not be made by the ruling class of this country. The liberation of women must be part of the liberation of all persons from the domination and exploitation of capitalism through a socialist revolution that is staged by the working class itself. We recognize that sexism did not begin with capitalism, and it's not guaranteed that merely with the end of capitalism, sexism will also end. It's a necessary condition that we defeat capitalism, but it's not sufficient. What's also necessary is that there be an independent working women's movement fighting side by side with their brothers for an end to capitalist oppression, ready to articulate and insistently press their claims so that the new socialist society which emerges, which forms and develops on the basis of equality and freedom for all persons, men and women. The speaker we have here today, Barbara Winslow, is the women's organizer of the International Socialists. She was active in CLU, the Coalition of Labor Union Women. She is an active member of Women Against Racism, which is an organization of working women and mothers who are fighting in Detroit for busing against racist organizations. She was an active trade unionist for 7 years, and she's the author of the pamphlet that's on the table. I think there are two of them there, but the one most relevant to what we'll be talking about is Revolutionary Feminism. And she'll be speaking tonight on the impact of the recession on working women.
Not supposed to clap yet. I should clap you, because it's very kind of you to all come out on this particularly icy evening, and I know that we in the International Socialists are very glad that you came. I'd like to talk a little bit about the economic crisis and its impact upon women, and a little bit about what women are doing to fight back, and also finally about what we in the International Socialists are doing to build a working class women's movement and a revolutionary party, which will end once and for all the subordination of women under capitalism and in society. Last year was International Women's Year, and Time magazine, a very popular news journal, had, instead of a man of the year, they couldn't find one man that was important enough, so they gave us 12 women of the year, if you remember in reading this. And they included such women as Betty Ford, Billie Jean King, Addie Wyatt, who is the highest woman official in the Amalgamated Meat Cutter, and other various and sundry women. And this Time magazine was in tribute to all the progress we have made and to the fact that, women have played an important role in American society. Well, in fact, this Time magazine Women of the Year cover was really disgusting. It was one of the most hypocritical things that this magazine ever did, because it didn't write about what women's lives are like today in American society. In fact, the Woman of the Year should have been Joanne Little. The Woman of the Year should have been Isabel de Carmo, the leader of the Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat in Portugal, an organization which is fighting for workers' revolution, not only in Portugal, but throughout the world. The Women of the Year should have been the women of the Brookside Women's Club, the women who went to jail, who suffered beatings and imprisonment in order for the miners to win a better contract. The Women of the Year should have been the working class women who have been fighting to fight the inflation, fighting for better wages and for organization. But Time magazine is not interested in us. They're not interested in the overwhelming majority of women in this country, working class women. They had nothing to say about what life was really like for women in this country and for women throughout this world. I want to give you some examples of what life is like for women today. 2 weeks ago in Detroit, a young woman who worked for the telephone company was raped. It was a very shattering and brutal experience. And because of this, the phone company fired her. They said she no longer was a good employee. Instead of treating her as a woman who had gone through a shattering experience, who should be given a month off or whatever counseling needed, she was expendable. Ma Bell, or Pa Bell, it should be Pa Bell because it's men who run that company, said she was expendable. Kick her out. Out she goes. A few days ago, a 70-year-old woman froze to death because the gas company wouldn't keep her gas going. This woman was found frozen to death, huddled in some rags and wrapped in a rug, desperately trying to keep warm. A 70-year-old woman who obviously couldn't live on the small social security she got. But of course, for the gas company, that didn't matter. Their profits are more important than human lives. Again, in my city, the city of Detroit, there was a cross burning in front of the house of a woman who's an active member of Women Against Racism. That's what life is like for women in this country today. Or for young women, women who are still in high school, who are told that they live in this great free enterprise system of democracy. When they graduate from high school, they'll be unemployed at least through the 80s. And you know, you don't get counted among the unemployed if you're not collecting unemployment. So they'll be just part of the forgotten section of the working class. What is life like for women today? Talk to women who in the late 60s and early 70s finally got better paying and better organized jobs. For example, in the auto plants. As a result of the economic crisis, the crisis not caused by working women and not caused by working men, but a crisis caused by the presidents of General Motors, of Ford, of Chrysler, a crisis caused by the bankers of this country, these women were all laid off. In the General Motors auto plant in Linden, New Jersey, every woman who was hired from 69 on was laid off. And do you know what the union did for those women? Not a damn thing except to forget them. In Lordstown, the very famous auto plant, the most modern auto plant in the world, the fastest assembly line in the world, they employed, as of 1973, 660 women. Something like 608 were laid off. And what did the union do about it? Not a thing. What did the company do about it? Not a thing. And so these women were laid off and were not able, because many of them had not worked there long enough, were not able to get the full benefits that many of the men did. In Twinsburg, Ohio, an auto plant which employed 218 women, 208 were laid off. What did the company do? Not a thing. What did the union do? Not a thing. And what did these women do? They had to suffer. That's what happened. That was reality for working class women in this country. Today, we are 40% of the workforce. Practically every woman in this country will work at some time in her life. So those of you who may be in school or may be unemployed or think that, well, you're going to escape this, you will at some time be a member of the paid labor force. Yet we take home 60% of what men make. And this is in spite all Time magazine's rhetoric about International Women's Year and all the gains women have made. In reality, the wage differential between men and women has increased. It has not grown smaller, it has increased. Unemployment is greater for women than it is for men, in spite of all Time magazine's rhetoric about International Women's Year and all the gains made due to such women like Betty Ford and Billie Jean King. It doesn't do much good to have Billie Jean King make a lot of money playing tennis. I think it's fine. I think it's terrific. She's done tremendous things for sports. But most of us will never be professional tennis players because we can't even afford tennis rackets. For working class women today, if you look at the question of poverty, 3 out of every 8 families in urban areas is headed by a woman. That means greater poverty in the cities. In the year of International Women's Year, with all the crap that Time magazine handed out about working women, if you work and if you have children, and 80% of all working mothers need child care, have to pay for it out of their own pocket, between 1/2 and 2/3 of your wages go to child care. Sometimes it's cheaper not to work because of problems in terms of paying for child care than it is. And former President Nixon, along with all his other crimes, vetoed a federally funded child care bill because he was afraid of breaking up the family. This is what life is like for working class women in this country, and all of Time magazine's polish and gloss can't cover it up, because we know, because we work. We know because we're unemployed. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. Because there's an attack that is building, an attack against working class women in this country, and in reality an attack against all women. Now, I'm going to tell you one funny story about the attack, and it starts off with the Pope. I'm sure most of you read about his great pronouncement about masturbation and sexual relations and all sorts of things like that. In case you didn't, the Pope has just let us know that masturbation is not very good. He didn't warn us about warts or losing your hair or going crazy. He just says it's not very good for you. And he warns about premarital sexual relations. And then he says, well, women's liberation is a very dangerous and subversive thing, although tells us that men should spend a little more time taking care of the family. Now, this all seems amusing. Who really cares? Isn't this funny? Who's going to worry about masturbation? And so forth and so on. But in the middle of January, the political arm of the American Catholic Church decided that it was going to have one objective this year, and that one objective was going to be to repeal, or to get repealed, the abortion ruling by the United States Supreme Court. A ruling which said that, yes, women can have abortions. I mean, there are all sorts of complications, but it was a tremendous step forward in terms of women, and in particular in terms of working class women, because 80% of all the women who died on the abortionist tables, or in the sinks, or wherever else working class women were found dead of abortions, were black and Latin women. So what the Catholic Church wants to do is mobilize a big attack against us on the question of abortion. And then Gerald Ford, who's mainly known for falling down all the time, comes out and says, well, gee, I'm really not so happy with the Supreme Court's ruling on abortion. Let's leave it up to states' rights. Now, I thought that argument was more or less settled in about 1868 and then finally with the Civil Rights Movement, but not according to our Neanderthal president. He would like us to go back 100 years. But President Ford, who falls down a lot and who seems like he's sort of dumb, is not all that dumb. He has a liberal face, and that's his wife, Betty. And we all love Betty. She's terrific. She was very courageous, and she speaks her own mind, but she's his liberal front. Betty Ford's in favor of the abortion ruling. She doesn't think there's anything wrong if maybe her daughter has an affair or two. All these sorts of things are intended to keep the liberal wing of the Republican Party in favor of Gerald Ford as he moves more and more to the right. But don't kid yourself, no matter all the talk Betty Ford gives, she's not the brains or the power behind President Ford. The people behind him are the most reactionary sections of the American ruling class, his friends are the president of U.S. Steel and other huge American corporations. So a movement is beginning to be built on the question of abortion, of rolling back the gains that we made, the right of women to choose their own biological destiny, the right of women not to be sterilized if we don't want to be sterilized, or the right of women to have abortions or to use contraception. The attack is going on in one legal field. In New York and in New Jersey, the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated. It was mainly defeated due to the total incompetency of the National Organization for Women, which was too afraid to mobilize masses of people for the ERA. But the reason the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated was due to a reactionary, racist, and sexist, and you will see very shortly, anti-labor movement. The women's movement is the first target, but it will go on to other things. And you can see clearer and clearer and clearer this attack against women. And I want to show you how it's beginning in another way. If we look at New York City, the city crisis, the whole response of the entire capitalist class to the city crisis is a response which is an attack upon women. Let's look at New York. New York is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Rockefellers, by David Rockefeller, by a small handful of men and their bankers. And they are the people who have driven that city into economic, social, and political chaos. It is not the working people of that city. And what do they want from the people of that city in order to save it? Very simply, they want to get out every last bit of blood from the city workers. And the overwhelming majority of city workers are women. Now, what was the first solution to the city crisis? Mass layoffs of city workers. The overwhelming majority of women city workers are black and Latin. You lay them off, they don't get much unemployment. They don't get much of that, and so it means greater poverty for the people in New York City. What was the second response of the entire capitalist class? From Gerald Ford to the mayor of the city, Beam, to the governor of the state, Carey. What was their response? Very simple. Let's start shutting down the public hospitals. After all, it's a lot cheaper to die than it is to care for sick patients. Now remember, many of the city hospital workers have been laid off, so you decide to shut down the hospital. The man who's Simon, the head of the Treasury Department, very rich man. He'll always go to private hospitals. He'll never have to worry about medical care and all that. His solution was to close down Bellevue Hospital. Well, if any of you have ever been in New York City or know anything about it, Bellevue was a place where you went to die anyway, because if it's a public hospital, you didn't get good funds, good care, and so forth and so on. But he wants to close down the last remaining public hospital for the people of New York City. What's been another response to the whole economic crisis? Well, you have lots of people who have been laid off and they're not working, and so they come up with another ingenious scheme. Let's make transportation even more expensive, up to 55 cents to ride the subway, and let's cut down on subway the number of trains that run. So if you work in New York City, and let's say you work in Manhattan and live in Queens, or live in Brooklyn and live in the Bronx, instead of taking 20 minutes to get home, it takes you an hour and a half to get home, which is a greater inconvenience upon women, especially if you have to pick up your son or daughter in the daycare center, or especially if you have to go shopping. So it's a greater burden upon the women who work in that city. They've also taken off the number of conductors who ride the subway, which means it's more dangerous, which means that the whole question of crime becomes a real question. And so women are now getting more and more afraid to even go to and from work on public transportation, because you never know if you're going to get stabbed or mugged. You always knew somebody was going to try to goose you or something, but that wasn't as bad as being killed. Now, the question of your safety is actually in jeopardy. The capitalist class, this small group of greedy men, want cuts in all forms of social welfare spending, whether it's aid to dependent children, whether it's food stamps, or whether it's the question of public parks and other public recreational places, museums and things like that. That's a big attack upon mothers, because after all, we have two jobs, right? We're out in the paid labor force 10, 12 hours a day, and then we're back in the home 8, 10, 12 hours a day, taking care of our families. And when they cut down on social services, such as transportation, such as museums, such as things like that, it's a greater burden on us. And it's not surprising that incidences of wife beating are on the rise, that child beating and the battered child syndrome is increasing. It's not because mothers hate their children more, and it's not necessarily because men hate women more. It's because you live in a society that's so barbaric and so brutal that until you see an alternative to American capitalism, you take it out on the people who live in your own immediate home. Now, this is all an attack on the working class, an attack on women in particular. And let's look at the past, in quotes, leaders of the women's movement. What has been their solution? How have they been leading us out of this particular mess into building a strong, aggressive, confident movement that can change all this? Well, let's take the founding mother of the modern women's movement, Betty Friedan. She is spending all her time praising the Pope, praising the Shah of Iran, and praising the Shah of Iran's sister as feminists. That's been her major solution to the economic crisis. And just very recently, when there was that UN resolution on racism and Zionism, she participated in a Zionist demonstration. That has been her response to the capitalist crisis, aside from the fact that in 1972 she supported Nixon over McGovern, not that there was any fundamental difference between the two, and that she's spending most of her time in the women's movement looking for lesbians under the beds, assuming that they're all CIA agents and ruining the women's movement. Now, speaking of CIA agents, we now move to Gloria Steinem, where recent evidence has shown that she probably was in the pay of the CIA. She's been an active member of the Democratic National Committee, a very conscious politician, and she has done absolutely nothing to build a working-class women's movement except to support glamorous liberal politicians down the line. Ella Grasso, the first woman elected governor in her own right, not because she, like with Wallace, with Merlene Wallace. What has been her solution to the economic crisis in terms of women? Very simple. She fires them all. She's been firing state officials in the state of Connecticut. She's just introduced an austerity budget in the state of Connecticut. She's fighting for working women and working men who work for the state of Connecticut to work a 50-hour week with 35 hours pay. That's not what women's liberation is. That's not what feminism should be. It doesn't mean that there's an increase of unemployment for women. Shirley Chisholm, a black woman who ran for president, who says she's part of the black movement and the women's movement. The only political act she's done in the past 3 years was to visit George Wallace after he had his you-know-what shot out by some maniac. Why? Because Shirley Chisholm is in the same political organization as George Wallace. She may be a liberal and George Wallace may be conservative, but they're in the same organization. There's one thing that I can say. There are no racists in my organization. We don't allow them in. And that's something that, people have these illusions about Shirley Chisholm. Ask her what she's doing in an organization with the Wallaces, the Stennises, the people who murdered Martin Luther King. That's the organization that she's a member of. And now let's look at laboring women. A year and a half ago, an organization called the Coalition of Labor Union Women was founded, and its president was a member of the UAW, the first woman official, called Olga Madar. And instead of building a mass, militant organization of working-class women that fought for equal pay, that fought for child care, that fought to end the discriminatory aspects of the layoffs, that fought about anything, she spent the entire year and a half trying to kill this organization, trying to kill out anybody who fought for activity, anybody who fought to challenge the sexism of the labor bureaucracy. That's what the labor bureaucracy did, the women in the labor movement, the high officials did about the economic crisis. They didn't do a damn thing. Excuse me, I'm wrong. They did. They supported Frank Fitzsimmons. They supported Leonard Woodcock. They supported George Meany down the line on every question. And that is why they killed one of the first and one of the most important women's organizations in the 20th century. And the reason why they're all doing this on every single question is because they accept capitalism. In the 60s, there was fat on the system. There was room to maneuver. Gloria Steinem can stand up in 1972 and say that she was a revolutionary, and people would believe it. But the fat on the system is slowly going away, and it's more difficult for them to maneuver, because now the question of class is becoming the key question in terms of building a working-class women's movement. It's a question of whose side are you on in the class questions. Are you on the side of working-class women? Are you on the side of the capitalists? And that's becoming the key question. And this is why working-class women have to begin to organize, to fight, and build a movement which will challenge all aspects of society. That is why we need a working-class women's movement. It's not some ideal that's floating around. It's a reality. Because if we had a working-class women's movement, it can fight against all these sorts of things. For example, take the city crisis. If we had strong rank-and-file movements in the teachers' union, in the sanitation workers' union, in the public employees' union in New York City, rank-and-file organizations that wouldn't take all the crap that they're taking from their bureaucratic leaders, they could fight against the attack going on by women. And that's what we have to begin to build. If we had a working-class women's movement, we could fight against the fact that all the women in auto were laid off. If we had a working-class women's movement, we could fight against the way capitalism portrays us. You know, all you have to do is watch TV or read any magazine, and we're either, of course, sex objects used to sell cars or detergent or something kinky like that, or we're dumb, stupid housewives who spend all their time worrying about waxy buildup on our kitchen floors. That's our role, and that's what every institution in this society says about women. That's why we need a working class women's movement, to tell the world what it is to be a woman, and that we can define and decide for ourselves what it means. In order to do that, we have to have a strategy. We have to be able to have a strategy that we can organize, but more important, a strategy to win. Because I will tell you that things may look bleak now, and they're only getting worse. And this is the importance of Marxism, because Marxism is the politics, is the theory, is the strategy of the working class, of the workers' movement. Marxism is not the theory of some professor. It is not the theory of some person off in a library. It is the politics of the working class. That's where it came from, and that's what it is. And so that's what we have to begin to look at. What's happening in this country, and what is the working class going to be doing about it? And one of the things that we have to look at is what's happening with the economy. It's not enough to go, oy vey, it's really pretty bad and we expect something catastrophic to happen. We have to try to be as precise as possible, because if you're wrong, it can also affect what your strategy is and how you're going to use it. Now, we believe that there's going to be a slight upturn in the economy, especially around election year. Now, this shouldn't surprise anybody. The last president who tried to run in the midst of a depression was Herbert Hoover, and of course he lost the election. There's going to be a slight upturn, but that upturn is not going to affect the overwhelming majority of workers in this country. It's not going to affect women workers. It's not going to affect black and Latin workers, and it's not going to affect young workers. It is only going to have an impact upon a certain section of the working class, which is sort of like your older, more skilled white workers. So don't think that this up means that there are going to be lots of jobs for all of us, that we can immediately go get a $7 an hour trucking or painting or electrician's job. No way. However, immediately after the election, almost like with precision timing, things are going to get worse. We're heading in for a very serious recession. There will be double-digit inflation, and by 1977, we will be in a depression worse than the one we're just slowly getting out of. And by the way, the depression we are now slowly getting out of has been the worst one since 1938. And of course, nobody rules it out of the question that there is going to be a depression that will make the 1929 depression look like a Sunday school picnic. Now, what is the ruling class going to do about this? Well, there's a very good chance that the Democrats are going to be elected in '76, and I think that that's terrific, because if any of you have any illusions that whoever it's going to be, Jackson, Humphrey, Kennedy, Udall, or any of the other people, that their strategy is going to be identical to that of Reagan's or Ford's or any other lunatic the Republicans try to pull up. And it's very simple what it's going to be. Attack the standard of living and the organization of the working class. That is going to be their strategy. It doesn't matter who runs in '76, and it really doesn't matter who wins in '76, because the capitalist class is united. They want to defeat the working class. We in the IS have a strategy. We want to defeat the capitalist class, and we want to build the strength, the confidence, and the combativity of the working class. And so what we are doing is beginning to go where workers are in motion. Now, '76 and '77 are going to be really sort of hell of a year, in case you didn't know, because not only is there going to be a presidential election, but the contract bargaining rounds of the most important unions in this country are all coming up. It began with the postal workers this summer, and the next one that comes up is the Teamsters Union. Now, the Teamsters Union is the biggest, most powerful, most corrupt union in the country, probably in the world. I just read a very interesting pamphlet which we're publishing about the mafia and corruption in the Teamsters Union, and guess who also hung out with all these mafiosi in the Teamsters Union? None other than our good friend Lee Harvey Oswald. So we'll never know who shot Kennedy. Maybe it was Frank Fitzsimmons for all we know. I mean, by the time the true story gets out, God knows what. We are building a rank-and-file movement in the Teamsters Union. Now, what does this have to do with women's liberation? Well, plenty, because some of the leaders of that rank-and-file movement are women. And they are bringing the politics of women's liberation into the most powerful, the strongest union in the world. Last week, I attended a meeting in Indianapolis of 650 pissed-off, angry Teamsters who work for a company called United Parcel Service. United Parcel Service is the largest employer of Teamsters in the country. Employs about 70,000. And about 6 months ago, a woman by the name of Ann Mackey from Cleveland, who works for United Parcel, put out a newspaper called Upsurge. And it took off, and probably 3/4 of all UPS workers read this magazine. And working for this company, by the way, is like being in the old action army. You have to wear 1950s General Eisenhower uniforms. You have to break your butt. I mean, this company, and then when you're 35, they sort of discard you because you're no longer as productive as you used to be. I was at this meeting, and there was a woman leading men. This is what we in the International Socialists believe is part of the strategy for building a working-class women's movement. Here was a young woman. And it was because she was in the IS, because she was a revolutionary, because she had a strategy to fight and win, that she could lead a mass movement, the vast majority of whom were men. And there was none of this, oh, we won't listen to some dumb broad or some dumb. They had to, because Anne was a fighter. And they didn't care if she was a woman. All they cared about was that she fought and that they would fight for her. And just to give you an example of what these men and women, because there are women who work for United Parcel, voted for, among many demands, one of them was paid maternity and paternity leave for UPS workers. Here is how you put women's liberation in practice. Here is how you convince men that it is in their interest to fight for women. Because if you don't fight with them, they're going to fight against you, and you're going to lose out in the end. The second most important union, perhaps, in this country is the United Automobile Workers Union. Very powerful, very strong, and very political. It's no accident that George McGovern in 1972 toyed with the idea of having Leonard Woodcock be his vice president. It's a very important union. There are women who are leaders in the rank-and-file movement that's being built in the UAW. Why? One of the reasons is because they're revolutionaries, because they're committed to building a working women's movement, and they're committed to bringing the politics of women's liberation into those important unions. And that's what we're involved in doing. But not all women work in factories, and not all women are in unions. And that's probably what you're all thinking about. Hey, that's only a small minority. Out of 37 million women who work, only 4 million are in unions. But when we go in to organize the unorganized, we are going to need a strong, powerful rank-and-file movement, because it's not going to be easy. Because to organize the millions of unorganized women means going into the South. And I'll tell you something, George Wallace, who says he's for the little man, he's the union man's best friend, you look at the labor record in the South. It's a right-to-work South, and that's what we're going to have to challenge. And in order to do that, we're going to come up against the Democratic Party. We're going to come up against the police. It's going to make the civil rights movement or the movement of the CIO seem like a Sunday school picnic. It is going to be one of the most cataclysmic things that's going to happen in 20th century American history. That's what's going to happen, and that's why we need a strong, unified, aggressive, confident labor rank-and-file movement that can give money, that can give organizers, that can help in terms of organization so we can win that important fight to unionize women. But many women don't work. And what do we say about them? Well, I'd like to just talk just for a few minutes about an organization that I helped build, and I'm still helping build in Detroit. It's called Women Against Racism. Now, Detroit is a city that went through busing. About 2 weeks ago, busing came to Detroit, and there was a group in Detroit called Mothers Alert Detroit, and they were against busing. And they were the only women's group that existed in the city of Detroit. And for about a year, they could run free in the city. They could hold public demonstrations, and nobody said a word about it. They could intimidate black people, and nobody said a word about it. And this is in a city that is a majority black city. This is in a city where we have a black mayor, where we have more black policemen, and yet there was no organization that said to MAD, get lost, we don't want this racist filth in our midst. But there's another and more important reason, and that is the whole question of racism. A racist movement is also being built in this country, and the issue is busing. Those racists are not opposed to busing. They're not opposed to federal court orders or injunctions or anything like that. They're opposed to integration. That's the only thing they stand for. They're racists. And they're getting a lot of legitimacy from the press. A year ago, Leslie Bacon, the first woman racehorse jockey, announced that she was in the KKK. And the New York Times wrote a full-page article on her in the women's section saying, "That's women's liberation. It's come to the Klan." Now, that article only gave legitimacy to the Klan because women's liberation and the Klan have nothing in common. Women's liberation means that organizations like the KKK will be gone forever. In the December issue of MS Magazine, Gloria Steinem, remember that great revolutionary feminist, had an article about Louise Day Hicks, who's in ROAR, Restore Our Alienated Rights. And they asked a very interesting question. Can you be a feminist and a racist as well? And according to MS Magazine, yes, you can. Louise Day Hicks is sort of a feminist. No, she's not. She's not a feminist. She has nothing to do with the ideals and goals of women's liberation and women's equality. We believe women can be reactionary, and those women have to be driven out of the movement. It's a question of class. It's a question of building a working class movement. And so we started this group called Women Against Racism. And what has been so amazing has been our success. We were formed in the middle of January. And on January 22nd, we called a counter-demonstration, Mothers Alert Detroit. That's what MAD's called, mothers. There are very few mothers. I might say mothers hyphenated, although I don't like to attack mothers because it gives them a bad name. They're full of Klans members, they're full of Nazis, and all sorts of professional right-wingers. It's not an organization of nice sort of like mothers who were just concerned with their children. So they held a demonstration on the 22nd of January. And we held a counter-demonstration. They had 100 people and we had 80. But we had better picket signs and a louder bullhorn, and our major chant was, "We're women, we're bad, we're gonna smash mad." And we got all the publicity. We made national TV, but more important, for working people in Detroit, for black workers and for those white workers who were in favor of busing and for school integration, was the first time that they heard of a group that was countering MAD, that wasn't polite about it and saying, "Oh no, free speech for racists and, fascists." It was a group that said, "No, we're driving them out of Detroit." And it meant a tremendous amount. A week later, when Ford came to town, MAD decided to have a caravan in support of him, demanding that he get rid of busing. And we showed up, and we turned that caravan away. Tonight, I want to get home and find out what happened, we are picketing MAD's February meeting. And we want MAD to know that any time they want to have a meeting, that they are going to be met with angry mothers, angry working people who are going to say, "You're never going to meet. We are going to drive you out of this city." And if we do it, it's a tremendous victory for the working class. We fight all aspects we're trying to fight. We're focusing mainly right now on the question of the schools. The first 2 weeks of busing, we showed up every morning with big picket signs that said, "Welcome to your new school, Women Against Racism," and to make sure that the racist violence that existed in Louisville and in Boston is not used against the children. And it was very good we were there because, for example, the first day in one of the schools I was out, some young white kids, bullies, showed up and they were going to throw ice things at these were like 12-year-old boys, and they were going to throw ice things at, 6, 7-year-old kids. And if we hadn't been there, there could have been trouble because the police weren't going to do anything because most of them are members of MAD. So we had to rely on ourselves. We are now challenging MAD to a debate, a live debate as well as radio debates, and we are growing quite rapidly. And I think it's very important because to build a movement of women, black and white women, given the historical problems of racism in the women's movement, to do this is a tremendous step forward. And the reason that Women Against Racism was formed in Detroit, and it's going to be formed in Louisville, is due to organizations like the International Socialists, revolutionaries who are committed in ending racism and ending sexism in society once and for all. And this is why you need a revolutionary organization, because you can't fight against sexism by yourself. You're up against the most barbaric, the most destructive, and the best organized machine in the world, and it lives in Washington. All you have to do is all the CIA stuff that goes on. You can see what you're up against. You can't do it by yourself. You need an organization of the best fighters, of the most committed fighters, who are in the IBT movement, who are in all the union struggles, are in the movements of the oppressed, in a fighting combat organization. You need a revolutionary newspaper like Workers' Power. I will tell you that the only newspaper that reports on the movement that's going on in the Teamsters Union is Workers' Power. The only newspaper that has reported about the fight against racism and in defense of busing has been Workers' Power. And it's not an accident. It's not that there are a bunch of good writers in Detroit. It's because the IS is the revolutionary organization that is putting those struggles forward. And so I would like to end by saying that I hope those of you who are not in the Bloomington branch of the International Socialists, I hope you work with us. I hope you join us. I hope you work with us in our industrial work and in our women's work. We're going to be having many other activities, and I think you should check us out. You should read Workers' Power. You should sell it to your friends, because workers don't have a better friend than Workers' Power, I assure you that. But most important, you need us in order to build this unified workers' movement, and we need you. We have to become a mass revolutionary party in the next couple of years, or else the capitalists are going to win, and they're going to institute a society even more barbaric than Hitler's fascism. But I know that we are going to be victorious. There's a revolution going on in Portugal, and it's spread to Spain. There's a revolution going on in Africa, and it's beginning to affect American workers. And this international revolutionary movement is going to be one unified revolutionary movement, which will end once and for all American capitalism, world capitalism, and its barbarism and destructiveness forever. Thank you.
Questions? You got all the answers?
Not quite.
Yeah.
I wonder if you read Shaw, Iran's sister's article in the New York Times about how much women have achieved so far.
In Iran?
Yeah.
Yes, actually, I did. She didn't write about all the women they shoot who disagree with the Shah, did she?
Just talk about that.
Yes. Yes, it's one of the most totalitarian societies, but of course we like to be friends with them because of how rich they are and all the oil that they're involved in.
Did Betty Friedan really?
Yes, it was in, yes. She supported Nixon, she's supporting the Shah of Iran, she's become extremely reactionary.
Yeah.
Getting back to Betty Friedan, what I missed the last NOW convention. Apparently, there was a victory that was played in the New York Times for the revolutionary forces that were going to take the women's movement. What's her name? Karen DeCrow. What kind of who are these people?
I don't know all the details of the split in NOW, but basically the defeat of the ERA in New York and New Jersey really shook up the middle-class women's movement. And it should have, because I'll tell you, they didn't do anything except that Alice Doesn't Day, which was really a joke. I mean, just to tell women just to go out on strike in this frivolous and non-serious way. Any serious working-class woman couldn't go out on strike. And the few women who did, over 100 women got fired because of it. So, you know, I mean, given what happens when you're fired, you don't get unemployment. It was really a bad thing to do. Now, what happened was, and they didn't mobilize people for it. Like, my sister lives in New York City, didn't even know the ERA was on the ballot till I called her up and said, oh, you should vote for it, you know. And I think that whole defeat, and it was a bad defeat, really started shaking them up. And if any of you have ever been in organizations, you will know that whenever you suffer a defeat, everybody starts complaining and saying you were wrong and that sort of thing. So Betty Friedan led us a conservative split-off, and it's called Woman Surge. And they're putting out some sort of a newspaper, and I keep thinking that she must be involved in UPS or something, have read Upsurge and heard about its success. That's why she called it Woman Surge or something like that. But it's the idea that if the women's movement is more and more respectable, it will get larger. Now, Karen DeCrow, her slogan was out of the mainstream and into the revolution. And what it means is that now the National Organization for Women will campaign more for politicians, which means that now it's going to get more active in the Democratic Party, which is a dead end for women. I mean, it's just an absolute and total dead end. The Democratic Party is going to stand for wage freezes, austerity measures. It's going to do everything Ella Grasso wants it to do. Yeah.
Yeah, do you think passing of the ERA would actually push a women's movement forward, or do you think it would kind of pacify women and actually set the movement back?
Let me first talk about the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act, and then answer that. In the 60s, there was a mass movement of blacks, in particular black workers. And the passage of the Civil Rights Bill in '64 did two things. It sort of was a sop, and it sort of cooled some of the energy. But on the other hand, it gave blacks and women a tool by which to sue and use the courts for gaining equality. However, how many civil rights acts have we had to pass since the 1964 one? You know, Malcolm X used to say if black people were citizens, we wouldn't need civil rights bills. And we've had to pass, I think, 2 or 3 civil rights acts since the '64 one. Now, I think if the Equal Rights Amendment passes, it's not going to hurt women. But the point is that there isn't a movement, really, of women. So what we in the IS are trying to do is build a movement of women that, when the Equal Rights Amendment passes, I think it probably will, we have a movement that can use that ERA to our advantage. Right now, if the ERA passes, I assure you it will only benefit predominantly middle-class women in legal things like the right to keep your own name or charge accounts and things like that. But the key questions for working-class women today are wages, working condition, the price of food, those sorts of questions. And that the Equal Rights Amendment really isn't going to touch, except maybe give us more equality on the food stamp line or something like that. But that's not the kind of equality we want. Yes?
Questions. Do you think the ERA can be used as a rallying point? And what are your ideas or views on strategies for passage, if not working within the party system, particularly in Indiana, if not pinpointing special districts and working to elect or working to defeat?
Well, the IS has a strategy for changing women's position in society, and it's in the working class. And it's starting off by building the rank and file movement, and by building working class women's organizations. I wish we were a mass party of thousands, of hundreds of thousands, because we could be everywhere, but we're not yet. We're going to be a mass party of thousands in the next year, year and a half. So we have to say, where can we be most effective fastest, given that we have a year and a half to build a mass revolutionary party. That's the timetable. I do not believe that to have the IS spending all its time and efforts on campaigning for the ERA is going to build a rank-and-file movement in the key unions, in the key sections of the working class, which are most important right now. What we would do is in our newspaper, we would urge people to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. Our newspaper gets around. We would advocate it at union meetings, in our rank-and-file groups and things like that. But the focus of the organization is in the working class, on the questions of building a rank-and-file movement that fights the bosses and the bureaucrats.
Then you do not see the ERA as a very high priority.
No, we're for its passage, but it's not like a top priority, no. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to say a word about the movement, the rank-and-file movement beginning in the Teamsters and also among UPS workers. Not only is it a movement that's being led by women, but it's also a movement that's being led by socialists. At this meeting that Barbara referred to, I also attended, and there were 2 people who spoke, Ann and a guy named Ken, who are explicit members of the International Socialists and the leaders of this movement. And everybody knows that. It is no secret. And nonetheless, in spite of that, when both of those people got up to speak, they received a standing ovation by 600 workers several times during their speech and when they sat down. So the current period offers openings to the left in a way that no other has for years and years and years. At that meeting, I myself, in talking to people, had at least 20 occasions to say to people, I was a socialist, and to, engage them in political conversation. That's something that 2 years ago just simply wouldn't have happened. But now people are looking for answers. And I attend a class that's attended by union people, and the conversation inevitably turns to very political questions. People know things are bad and they want answers. And they want to talk to people who are willing to fight around issues that concern them.
Yeah, Steve?
Yeah, perhaps you could say something about the relationship between family and the working class and the way that capitalism affects that.
The family. Oh, that's another talk. It serves two functions, the family. It preserves capitalism, and it cushions the working class and the barbarity of this society. It's a very difficult kind of question, because right now the working class family oppresses women, because the woman has to keep it going, right? If you get divorced, and if there are any divorced women here, they know, sort of like it's your fault, and there's something a little bit scarlet about you anyway. If you're divorced, you're a lot more interesting sometimes, but it's difficult to get credit. You can't open charge accounts. I mean, you're seen as somebody bad. If your children are, and I use this in quotes, very juvenile delinquents, that's what capitalism causes children who are fighters, you're assumed to be an unfit mother. So all the burdens of keeping this family together are placed upon the woman. And I really didn't talk about the assault on women in terms of the family. One of the most disgusting TV shows is Little House on the Prairie. I mean, I watched it a couple times. I want to throw it out the window, the TV out the window, because it's so disgusting. It's these homilies, or the Waltons, The Depression was really fun. That was what it was, that's what it was really called. As a matter of fact, the divorce rate in the Depression rose, especially among workers, because when you're poor, and when you have to fight over money, and when everything is a goddamn struggle, tensions break out. And unless you're in a revolutionary organization, you fight each other instead of the capitalists and the bureaucrats and stuff like that. So the question then is, okay, you say the family has to be gotten rid of, the present family under capitalism. Well, I'll tell you, if I had spoken to, at that meeting, about destruction of the family, everybody's on, who is that lunatic? So the question is, how do you deal with the oppressive nature of the family? By raising the question of maternity leave, of child care centers, for example, of, like in the IS, we make sure that there's child care at all our meetings, so that women, whether they're members of the IS or they're sympathizers, they're working with us, they can participate in a full way. In the TDC that Ann spoke about, we have child care at all TDC meetings. We encourage women who are married to truckers to come to the meeting. It's one person, one vote. Because, if you're married to the guy, a wage increase is going to affect you too. And so that's very important. We also believe that children should have rights. And that's one of the reasons why we have a revolutionary youth organization. Full rights. Full rights. We have a revolutionary youth organization called the Red Tide, and which fights for economic and political and social equality for young people in society. And these are the ways that you can deal with the family. Because under socialism, I believe, quote, families will exist. People will want to live together for human love, comfort, compassion, all the things that make you want to live with people. But it will be based upon genuine affection and respect, and not upon economic or other necessities. And
Yeah, just continuing on the same vein about the family. I think one of the reasons why the women's liberation movement in the 1969-70 appeared so threatening to working class women, and why they just kind of, a bunch of bra-burning kooks. Well, one was the fact that the media did us such a bad turn, but also it was because of their position on the family. Because a lot of these middle-class women went around just attacking the family willy-nilly, but for a working-class woman, that was her only thing in the world, which was of her creation. So it was just bad tactically to go out and attack the family directly like that. Women who stay home, it's not that they're less oppressed than women who work, but it's that they're very unlikely to organize for their own emancipation, because they're so atomized, so isolated. And that if a working class women's movement is to be built, it is on the shop floor. It's going to flow out of those kinds of struggles, and that will flow back into the home as well. But that's where you start. You don't start by attacking the family.
yeah.
I'd like to question that point of view. It seems we have two examples of where that hasn't worked. That is in the Soviet Union and China, where the organization has developed solely from the place of work. And in both cases, the gains of women seem to be moderate, let me say, because they have ignored the structure of the family and rural socialization. Does the IS take that into account in any way in its organization of women?
Sorry, what do we...
Raising consciousness beyond the place of work?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think the point Anne was trying to make is that in terms of a strategy, women who work are already organized at the workplace. You know, they're organized collectively. And that it's a scientific fact that women who work are also sort of like more politically open to new ideas as opposed to women who work in the home. And for example, just in terms of, quote, women who work in the home, if you look at the rank and file movements that we're involved in, many of the wives are very active on an equal basis. So in that sense, yes, we do take into account, you know, I mean, the consciousness of the working class is very uneven. There are also going to be times when, quote, housewives are going to be even more radical than women in production. The point is, what is the consciousness of the class right now? That's the thing you have to look at. I mean, a working class women's movement is going to come from all sections of working class women. You can't say which section right now is going to lead it or be, you know, because we just don't know that. And as a matter of fact, in history, you know, housewives have played extremely militant roles, especially in the question of food prices and things like that. And even in recent memory, I mean, 1974 was the Brookside Women's Club, where when miners in Harlan County were striking, the women formed this group called the Brookside Women's Club. And when the courts came down with their usual injunctions against the miners, the women said, okay. They went out and picketed, fought with cops, went to jail, you know, they fought. They were, in one sense, their consciousness leapt over that of the men because of their fantastic oppression and isolation in the home. So that the whole consciousness of the class is very different. On the question of women in the Soviet Union and China, I don't know if what you were getting at, but we believe that China and Russia are class societies. They're not like capitalist class societies, but they're class societies, and women are oppressed in those as well. Now, recently, there's been a lot of attention paid to China, you know. Many people, and it's very interesting. It's mainly liberals who've been really propounding this myth that women are free in China. I remember Shirley MacLaine came back from China, and she appeared on the David Susskind show, and she was wearing this very low-cut dress and a lot of jewelry and makeup. And she said women were free in China because they wore these great unisex clothes and they didn't have to bother about sex. And David Susskind, who's an asshole anyway, I mean, I'm not praising him, just looked at her and said, well, would you like to live there? And she said, well, it's fine for them. It's just not fine for me. Now, you know, I just seem to think that that's slightly a racist point of view. Yeah, those Chinese people can live under a totalitarian dictatorship, but not us Americans or something like that. If you look at the position of women in China, you will find some interesting facts. The wage differential is increasing. It sort of was narrowing in the 50s. It is increasing today. The fact that the Chinese government is now diverting a lot of the money that it spent on the question for child care to arms production. All these sorts of things show that the gains women made in China after the 47 revolution, when Mao took power, are actually being eroded. And there are a whole range of reasons for this. In the Soviet Union, people always say, well, there are more women doctors in the Soviet Union. Well, that may be true, but the point is being a doctor is not so prestigious in the Soviet Union. If you want to find out where women are find out how many women are professors or scientists, and then it's about like how many women are doctors in this country. The wage gap is tremendous. And in Russia, for example, the wages, of course, are tremendously different. There's fantastic discrimination in work, and women are still responsible for the home. All the gains that were made in the Russian Revolution were taken away and lost with the rise and the triumph of Stalinism in the 30s. And that's another reason. I mean, the point that has to be made is that our fate as women under capitalism lies with the fate of the entire working class. And that's why we have to build both the women's organizations and the workers' organizations, because women are not going to achieve emancipation by themselves, because our exploitation and oppression under capitalism is not separate from capitalism.
Yeah.
Excuse my naivety, but I'm relatively new to a lot of this. You stated a lot of things that are wrong right now, and you sort of alluded to some of the things that you're going to be doing to alleviate that, as you move forward. But if you do get some sort of control, I don't know if you will or not, but what is your strategy once you get there, and what's going to happen?
Okay, we stand for a socialist revolution, and we believe that we, and it's not me, but it's we, are going to win. In a society where the working class owns and controls the wealth, the means of production, the government, the state, more or less. That's what it means. And it means a society where there is no discrimination, because the reason that discrimination against women exists is to keep profits in the hands of 2% of the population, to keep, the capitalist system has one driving motor force, and that is the profit system. I'll give you one example of the most brutal thing. Have all of you heard about that Keepone case? The family that, the man's sterile, he's going to die in probably about a year. Lives are lost every day to keep the profits. That wouldn't exist under socialism, because we would produce goods for human use and not for private profit, which would mean that we wouldn't need to produce stuff like Keepone. It would mean that, to me, the greatest example I like to give is all you have to do is look at the money we spend on arms. I don't believe anybody here has bought a rocket or a missile or a bomb. We have no use for them, and yet we spend most of our money on junk and dangerous junk. That's it. These damn bombs we produce are obsolete as soon as they come out of the assembly line or the factory or whatever it is. We produce napalm. We spend most of our money on stuff on destruction. Why not use it to produce hospitals, better transportation, more schools, more child care centers? If you talk to most workers, they want a decent life. They want a life where they can work, but also where they can enjoy life. Why not work 3 hours a day in whatever job it would be, driving a truck or driving a train, and going to school, different kinds of schools, not the way they run schools today, or working in an orchestra, playing in an orchestra for 3 hours a day, and doing something else. The human potential is just unbelievable. Under feudalism, they built a city like Venice, one of the most beautiful city in the world, okay? Can you imagine what you can build in a society where we have the technology, where we have the wealth, we have the resources? The reason we don't build beauty anymore is we just build for profit. Where we could have more doctors. The reason we don't have enough doctors is the greedy AMA wants to keep, a couple doctors making lots of money, and so most people can't learn medicine or law or other sorts of professions that are useful.
So exactly what's your strategy for changing the people's minds as they stand now into believing that, this type of society is better, and changing people from, it seems that one of the reasons we're in this, the predicament we're in now is because people accept it.
Well, I think the working class is changing fantastically. I don't believe workers in this country, or right now, important sections of the working class, no longer accept what the government and the bosses tell them. Let me give you an example. Take the miners. When it really started? In 1973 with the truckers.
Are you poor, forlorn, and hungry? Are there lots of things you lack?